Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The fog in London has a texture. It's not simply an absence of sight, it's a presence. A damp, cold, yellow-gray blanket, thick with coal smoke and river mist, that clings to the cobblestones, muffles the clip-clop of horses, and swallows the gaslight, reducing its glow to a faint, spectral aureole. It tastes of soot and damp earth. In the autumn of 1888, this fog felt different. It felt like a shroud settling over the district of Whitechapel, a place that was already a world unto itself, a dark island of squalor and desperation within the wealthiest, most powerful empire on earth. This was the London of Queen Victoria, the London of imperial grandeur, of gleaming new railway stations and stately stone banks. But the East End was the city's dark secret, its festering wound, hidden away from the polite society of the West End. Here, life was a currency spent quickly and cheaply. Hundreds of thousands were crammed into fetid tenements and squalid lodging houses, paying a few pence for a bed or, for the truly destitute, a spot on a bench with a rope to lean on while they slept. It was a place of shadows, both literal and metaphorical, where the forgotten and the damned scraped by in the margins of a society that wished they would simply disappear. And it was into these shadows that a new kind of horror was born. A horror that would not only terrify a city, but would fundamentally change the way we hunt for evil. On the morning of Friday, August 31, 1888, a carman named Charles Cross was walking down Bucks Row, a dark and narrow street flanked by warehouses and cottages, on his way to work shortly before 4 a.m. The fog was thick, the air still, the silence broken only by the distant chime of a church clock. As he passed a stable gateway, he saw a bundle lying on the ground, a dark shape against the darker pavement. In the gloom, he thought it was a tarpaulin, perhaps discarded by a workman. Drawing closer, he realized his mistake. It was the body of a woman. Her skirts were pulled up to her waist. He and another man who happened along, Robert Paul, straightened her clothing out of a sense of public decency and, assuming she was drunk or perhaps dead from a seizure, went to find a constable. When Police Constable John Neal arrived minutes later, he bent down with his bullseye lantern, casting a stark circle of light on the scene. The truth was revealed to be far more grotesque. The woman's throat had been cut so deeply, twice from left to right, that she was nearly decapitated. Her abdomen bore a series of vicious, jagged wounds. Her name, they would soon learn, was Mary Ann Nichols, a 43-year-old mother of 5, estranged from her family and forced by poverty and alcoholism into the transient, dangerous life of a Whitechapel prostitute. The murder of Mary Ann Nichols was brutal, but in a district where violence, especially against women, was a grimly accepted feature of daily life, it was not initially seen as the work of an unprecedented predator. That perception would change. The killer, who would soon acquire the infamous moniker Jack the Ripper, was just beginning. His reign of terror would last only a few short months, but his legacy is eternal, not just for the ghastly nature of his crimes or the fact that he was never caught, but for something else entirely. He created a vacuum in policing, in forensics, in criminology. The established methods of investigation, honed over decades of catching common criminals, proved utterly useless against him. He was a phantom, leaving behind only mutilated bodies and a city paralyzed by fear. And in that vacuum, in that desperate, frantic scramble to understand an enemy they couldn't see, investigators were forced to forge a new weapon. They had to stop looking for just a man and start imagining a type of man. They had to build a psychological effigy. Today, we dissect the anatomy of an investigation. we explore how the failure to catch the world's most famous serial killer forced law enforcement to look beyond the evidence, beyond the clues, and into the dark architecture of the killer's mind, giving birth to the very concept of criminal profiling. To truly understand the Ripper, one must first be immersed in his hunting ground. Whitechapel in 1888 was not merely a poor neighborhood, it was a societal pressure cooker, the result of decades of unchecked industrialization and immigration. The social reformer Charles Booth, in his exhaustive, multi-volume study, Life and Labor of the People in London, created what became known as the poverty maps. He and his team of investigators walked every street, lane and alley of the city, color-coding them by level of wealth and class. A great deal of Whitechapel and the surrounding Spitalfields area was colored in shades of dark blue and black. Dark blue represented the very poor, casual chronic want, while solid black signified the lowest class, vicious semi-criminal. These black-marked streets were the killer's territory. This was a world of labyrinthine rookeries, densely packed warrens of crumbling houses connected by unlit passages and blind alleys. Streets like Dorset Street, later dubbed the worst street in London, were lined with common lodging houses, or doss houses. Inside one of these, for fourpence, a person could get a bed in a vast, foul-smelling dormitory filled with the coughing and muttering of dozens of strangers. For twopence, you could sleep in the coffin beds, simple wooden boxes. And for a penny, there was the penny hang, where a rope was strung across the room, and men and women would drape themselves over it to sleep, before the rope was cut in the morning to wake them. Sanitation was a foreign concept. A single water tap and a privy in a back courtyard might serve 100 people. The air was thick with the stench of human waste, cheap gin, coal smoke, and the nearby tanneries and slaughterhouses. Disease, tuberculosis, diphtheria, cholera, was a constant companion. The average life expectancy in these areas was less than 30 years, a fraction of what it was in London's opulent West End. Work, when it could be found, was grueling. Men lined up at the dock gates each morning, hoping to be chosen for a day of backbreaking labor unloading cargo ships. Women took in laundry, assembled matchboxes at home for a pittance that often resulted in a bone-rotting disease called phasie jaw, or worked 16-hour days in sweatshops. And when all else failed, when there was no money for a bed or a bit of gin to numb the cold and hunger, many women turned to prostitution. It is crucial to dispel the romanticized image of the Victorian courtesan. The unfortunates, as they were euphemistically called, were not alluring young women. They were, almost without exception, desperate, middle-aged women whose lives had been ravaged by poverty, abuse, and alcoholism. They were victims of their environment long before they became victims of the Ripper. They solicited customers on the street for a few pence, the price of a drink or a doss-house bed, and their transactions took place in the darkest, most secluded corners they could find. Unlit alleyways, shadowed courtyards, the back of a tenement building. They were vulnerable, transient, and, in the eyes of a society obsessed with moral purity, utterly disposable. This environment of anonymity, darkness, and desperation was the perfect ecosystem for a predator to thrive. The killer could find a victim, led her to a secluded spot under the pretense of a transaction, commit his horrific act, and melt back into the labyrinthine streets, all within a matter of minutes. The fog wasn't just weather, it was camouflage. The anonymity of the crowd wasn't just a social condition, it was a shield. The 5 women generally accepted as the Ripper's canonical victims were emblematic of this world. The first, Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly, was born in 1845. She had married a printer's machinist, William Nichols, and had 5 children. For a time, she had a stable working-class life. But the marriage disintegrated, partly due to her heavy drinking, and by 1888 she was adrift. She cycled in and out of the Lambeth workhouse, a place of last resort for the indigent. Letters she wrote to her father reveal a woman struggling to hold on, speaking of a new job as a domestic servant, and her hopes for a better life. But these hopes were dashed. In the last week of her life, she was living in a lodging house in Spitalfields. On the night of her death, she was seen trying to earn the fourpence for her bed. "I'll soon get my DOS money," she told a friend. "See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." She was last seen alive, walking down Osborne Street, at 2:30 a.m., just over an hour later. Charles Cross found her body on the dark pavement of Bucks Row. 8 days later, on September 8th, the killer struck again. In the pre-dawn gloom, John Davis, an elderly resident of a lodging house at 29 Hanbury Street, stepped into the small paved backyard. He was met with a sight of unimaginable horror. Lying near the steps to the back door was the body of another woman. It was Annie Chapman, 47 years old. She was known as Dark Annie due to her dark hair. Like Polly Nichols, she had once known a better life. She was married to a gentleman's coachman and had 3 children. But the death of her oldest daughter from meningitis sent her into a spiral of depression and alcoholism that shattered her family. By 1888, she was living hand-to-mouth in Spitalfields. On the morning of her death, she was turned out of her lodging house because she didn't have her DOS money. She was ill, feeling low, but told a friend she had to go and find the money somewhere. She was last seen alive by a witness, Elizabeth Long, talking to a man near 29 Hanbury Street. At around 5:30 a.m., Mrs. Long described the man as having a shabby-genteel appearance, wearing a deerstalker hat and a dark overcoat. Minutes later, John Davis discovered Annie's body. Her throat had been severed by 2 deep cuts. But this time, the killer had gone much further. Her abdomen had been sliced open entirely. Her small intestines had been lifted out of her body and placed on her right shoulder. A portion of her uterus had been cleanly excised and taken from the scene. 2 brass rings she was known to wear were also gone. The chilling precision of the removal immediately sparked a terrifying theory among the medical examiners. The killer possessed anatomical knowledge. A doctor who examined the body at the scene, George Bagster Phillips, noted the skill involved. The idea of a homicidal surgeon, a Dr. Death stalking the East End, took root in the public imagination and the press. The police were now facing something far beyond a simple, albeit brutal, murder. They had a repeat killer, one who was escalating in his violence and audacity. The investigation was led by detectives from Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigation Department, or CID, including the thoughtful and methodical Inspector Frederick George Aberline. Aberline and his men were competent, experienced detectives, but their methods were grounded in a different era of crime. Police work in 1888 consisted of witness canvassing, informant cultivation, and painstaking shoe-leather detective work. They would follow up on every lead, question hundreds of people, and try to piece together a timeline. But what do you do when there are no reliable witnesses? What do you do when the crime scene itself offers no clues? The very concept of a modern crime scene was non-existent. When a body was found, crowds would gather instantly. Police officers, journalists, and morbidly curious onlookers would trample all over the area, contaminating any potential evidence. Forensics as a science. Fingerprinting had been proposed as an identification method, but was not yet in use by British police forces. That would be more than a decade away. There was no way to test for blood types, no way to analyze fibers or hair with any degree of certainty. The only real evidence the police had was the victim's body itself. The coroner's inquest became the central theater of the investigation. Here, presided over by the local coroner Wynne Edwin Baxter, a jury of local citizens would hear testimony from witnesses and medical experts to determine the cause of death. It was at Annie Chapman's inquest that Dr. Phillips publicly stated his belief that the killer displayed anatomical knowledge, a good deal of it. He speculated that the instrument used was a very sharp knife with a thin, narrow blade, at least 6 to 8 inches in length, probably longer, perhaps like one a doctor might carry for post-mortem examinations. The press seized on this, and the terror in London ratcheted up. The killer was no longer just a brute. He was a monster with a calculating, almost scientific mind. As September wore on, the city was in a state of high alert. The press, a booming industry in Victorian London, with dozens of daily papers competing for readership, fanned the flames of panic. Sensational headlines and lurid, often fabricated details sold papers. The killer of Whitechapel was becoming a dark celebrity. And then he was given a name. On September 27th, the Central News Agency received a letter, written in red ink. It was taunting, arrogant, and chilling. It began, "Dear Boss," and went on to mock the police for their inability to catch him. "I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled," it read. The author boasted that his knife was so nice and sharp, and promised to clip the ladies' ears off in his next job and send them to the police. The letter was signed, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Initially, police and the news agency dismissed it as a prank, one of hundreds they were receiving. But then came the night of September 30th, a night that would become known as the double event. In the early hours, the killer claimed 2 victims in less than an hour in 2 different police jurisdictions. The first was Elizabeth Stride, a Swedish immigrant. Stride had a particularly tragic life, marked by illness and a failed marriage. She was known for telling fantastical stories, including a claim that her husband and children had died in the sinking of the Princess Alice on the Thames. On the night of her murder, she was seen several times with a man, possibly the same one, described as being of average height with a dark mustache. At 1 a.m., Louis Diemschitz, the steward of the International Working Men's Educational Club, turned his pony and cart into the adjacent Dutfield's yard off Burner Street. His pony shied. In the darkness, he saw what he thought was a drunken person on the ground. When he lit a match, he discovered Elizabeth Stride's body. Her throat was cut, and she was still bleeding, indicating she had been killed just moments before he arrived. But her body was otherwise unmutilated. The prevailing theory is that Diemschitz's arrival interrupted the killer, who fled into the night. Furious and denied his ritual, the killer sought another victim. He found her less than a mile away, in Mitre Square, a small, dark square within the jurisdiction of the City of London Police, a separate force from the Metropolitan Police who patrolled the rest of London. The victim was Catherine Eddowes. 46 years old, Eddowes was a strong, intelligent woman known for her lively personality and her talent for writing and singing popular ballads. Earlier that evening, she had been arrested for being drunk and disorderly and was held at Bishopsgate Police Station until she sobered up. Upon her release at 1 a.m., she cheerfully told the desk sergeant, "Good night, old cock." Just 45 minutes later, her body was discovered by a city constable on his beat. The mutilations were the most horrific yet. Her throat was cut, her face disfigured with deep cuts to her cheeks and nose, and her abdomen ripped open. Her left kidney and a major part of her uterus had been removed and taken by the killer. In a chilling echo of the Dear Boss letter, the lobe of her right ear had been partially detached. This detail, which had not been released to the public, convinced many that the letter was genuine. The name Jack the Ripper was now indelibly linked to the killer. The letter was published in newspapers, and the moniker entered the global lexicon. 3 days later, the Central News Agency received a postcard, also written in red ink. It was spattered with what looked like blood. It referred to the double event, saying, "Number 1 squealed a bit, and he had not time to get ears for police." It was signed Saucy Jackie. The legend was now fully formed. The double event also exposed a major flaw in the investigation: the rivalry between the two police forces. The Metropolitan Police, under the command of the widely disliked Sir Charles Warren, were responsible for Whitechapel. Mitre Square, however, fell under the authority of the smaller but generally more respected City of London Police. The two forces did not always cooperate effectively. This was disastrously illustrated on the night of Catherine Eddowes's murder. A short walk from Mitre Square, in Golston Street, Police Constable Alfred Long discovered a piece of Eddowes's bloodied apron in the entryway of a tenement building. On the brick wall above it, scrawled in chalk, was a message: "The Jewess are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." This was the single most promising clue of the entire investigation. It was a physical piece of evidence, linking a location to the victim, and a message, however cryptic, from the killer. But what happened next is a source of bitter controversy to this day. When Commissioner Warren of the Met arrived on the scene, he ordered the writing to be erased immediately, before it could be properly photographed at dawn. His stated reason was to prevent anti-Semitic riots in an area with a large and often persecuted Jewish population. But to the detectives on the ground, it was an act of unforgivable incompetence. A photograph could have been taken. The writing could have been preserved. Instead, the only tangible link to the Ripper was washed away with a bucket and sponge. With the investigation stalled, and public fear at a fever pitch, a new dynamic emerged. Community leaders in the East End, frustrated with the police's failure, formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Led by a local builder named George Lusk, they organized their own patrols, hired private detectives, and offered a reward for the killer's capture. It was Lusk who would receive the most gruesome communication of all. On October 16th, he received a small cardboard box in the mail. The postmark was from London. Inside, nestled in cotton wool, was half of a human kidney, preserved in spirits of wine. The accompanying letter, written in a spidery, semi-literate hand, began, "From Hell." The writer claimed to have fried and eaten the other half of the kidney, stating it was very nice. The letter ended, "Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." Dr. Thomas Openshaw at the London Hospital examined the kidney. He determined it was from a human female, approximately 45 years of age, that it was a left kidney, and that it showed signs of Bright's disease, a chronic kidney ailment. Catherine Eddowes, the victim whose left kidney had been taken, was 46 and known to suffer from Bright's disease. The connection seemed horribly concrete. The "From Hell" letter, unlike the theatrical "Dear Boss" letter, is considered by most modern experts to be authentically from the killer. Its grim content and labored writing stood in stark contrast to the jaunty tone of the Saucy Jackie correspondence. It felt real. The police were now buried under an avalanche of information, theories, and public pressure. They had conducted thousands of interviews. They had detained and questioned dozens of suspects, from local butchers and slaughtermen to sailors and physicians. Sir Charles Warren even authorized a bizarre and desperate plan to have detectives disguise themselves as women to act as decoys, though it never came to fruition. But they had nothing. The killer was too careful, too cunning. He left no witnesses and no conventional clues. It was in this moment of desperation this utter failure of traditional police work, that the focus began to shift. If they couldn't find him through conventional means, perhaps they could understand him. Perhaps they could build a picture of the man based on his deeds. This is where Dr. Thomas Bond enters the story. Bond was a highly respected police surgeon, the surgeon for the A Division of the Metropolitan Police. In early November 1888, after the final and most gruesome murder, that of Mary Jane Kelly, Inspector Aberline asked Bond to review the case files for the previous victims and provide his expert opinion. Bond went further. After performing the autopsy on Kelly's horrifically mutilated remains, he penned a report on November 10th that would become a foundational document in the history of criminal investigation. In it, he laid out the first known offender profile. He began by directly addressing the popular theory that the killer must have scientific or anatomical skill. He dismissed it entirely. He wrote, "In each case, the mutilation was inflicted by a person who had no scientific or anatomical knowledge. In my opinion, he does not even possess the technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer. I believe he is a man of solitary habits, subject to periodical attacks of homicidal and erotic mania. The character of the mutilations indicates that the man may be in a condition of satyriasis," he continued. "The murderer in external appearance is quite likely to be a quiet, inoffensive-looking man, probably middle-aged, and neatly and respectably dressed. I think he must be in the habit of wearing a cloak or overcoat, or he could not have escaped notice in the streets with blood stains on his hands and clothes." He concluded that the homicidal impulse may have developed from a revengeful or brooding condition of the mind, or that religious mania may have been the original disease, but I do not think this was revolutionary. Bond was not describing a specific person. He was describing a personality, a set of psychological characteristics. He was inferring the killer's inner world from the evidence of his brutality. He was looking at the what, the where, and the how of the crimes to deduce the who. He suggested the killer was a loner, driven by uncontrollable sexual and murderous urges, satyriasis, and erotic mania. He was outwardly normal, even respectable, which allowed him to move about unnoticed. He was not a skilled surgeon, just a man in the grip of a frenzy. This was a radical departure from simply looking for a man with a grudge or a financial motive. Bond was building a psychological blueprint. The police were no longer just looking for a man with blood on his coat. They were now looking for a quiet, respectable-looking man who was secretly a raging psychopath, a man who could walk among them, unnoticed, until his mania descended. This was the birth of the hunt for the unknown subject, or unsub. Bond's profile was informed by the final, horrific crescendo of the Ripper's reign. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly. 25-year-old Kelly was younger and, by all accounts, more attractive than the other victims. She was also the most enigmatic. Legends swirled about her, that she came from a well-to-do family in Wales or Ireland, and had spent time in a high-class brothel in the West End before her fortunes declined. Whatever the truth, by 1888 she was living in a single, 12-foot square room at 13 Miller's Court, a squalid dwelling at the end of a dark passageway off Dorset Street. Unlike the other victims, she had a room of her own. This gave the killer something he had never had before: privacy and time. On the morning of November 9th, a day after the annual Lord Mayor's show, Kelly's landlord sent his assistant, Thomas Bowyer, to collect her overdue rent. He knocked, but got no answer. He walked around to the side and peered through a broken window pane, pushing aside a dingy curtain. The scene inside was a vision from hell. He ran to get the police. What they found when they broke down the door defied description. The small room was a slaughterhouse. Mary Kelly's body was in the center of the bed, but it was barely recognizable as a human being. The slaughter was almost total. Her face was hacked away beyond recognition, her throat cut down to the spine. Her breasts had been cut off. Her abdomen was emptied of its organs, and her viscera, along with her uterus, kidneys, and one breast, were placed beneath her head. Her other breast was by her right foot. Her liver was placed between her feet. Her intestines were draped over her right arm. The flesh had been stripped from her thighs and legs, leaving the bones exposed. Her heart had been removed and was missing from the scene. The walls were splattered with blood. In the grate, a fire had been burning so intensely that it had melted the spout off a kettle. It is believed the killer used the light from the fire to see as he worked for what must have been hours. It was a scene of such unbelievable carnage that even seasoned police officers were physically ill. It was the work of a man completely consumed by his rage, a frenzy of mutilation that was the ultimate expression of his psychopathy. And then, after this final apocalyptic act of violence, he vanished. The murders stopped. Jack the Ripper disappeared as suddenly as he had arrived, leaving behind only 5 dead women, a terrified city, and a ghost that would haunt criminology forever. So, who was he? The case files are filled with suspects, and over the past 130 years, amateur and professional historians have proposed more than 100. Applying Bond's profile, we can examine a few of the most prominent candidates. One of the leading contemporary suspects was Montague John Druitt. Born in 1857, Druitt was a 31-year-old barrister who also worked as an assistant schoolmaster in Blackheath. He came from a respectable upper-middle-class family. His father was a prominent surgeon. This immediately raises flags. He was outwardly respectable, and his family supposedly suspected him of being the Ripper. Crucially, his body was pulled from the River Thames on December 31, 1888. His pockets were filled with stones, and he had been missing for weeks. A suicide note was found, referencing his recent dismissal from his teaching post on grounds of a serious offense. The timing was highly suggestive. Did the killer commit suicide after his final act? This theory was favored by Sir Melville Macnaghten, Assistant Chief Constable of the CID, who in an 1894 memorandum named Druitt as his preferred suspect. However, the case against Druitt is entirely circumstantial. He lived miles from Whitechapel, and there is no evidence he ever frequented the area. The serious offense that got him fired was more likely related to his homosexuality, which was a criminal act at the time. Another of Macnaghten's top suspects, and one favored by modern researchers, was Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was a Polish-Jewish immigrant who worked as a hairdresser in the heart of Whitechapel. He was severely mentally ill, suffering from auditory hallucinations, paranoia, and a self-abusive tendencies. He was institutionalized in the Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in 1891. Case notes describe his great hatred of women and his homicidal tendencies. He lived in the area, fit the profile of a solitary and disturbed individual, and was identified, albeit not with enough certainty for a prosecution, by a witness. The strongest evidence is the Swanson marginalia. Notes handwritten by Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, a lead investigator on the case, in the margins of a copy of the memoirs of his superior, Sir Robert Anderson. Anderson wrote that the Ripper was a low-class Polish Jew. Swanson elaborated, naming the suspect as Kosminski and stating that he was identified by a witness who saw him with Liz Stride, This is compelling, coming from a senior detective. In recent years, an author claimed to have extracted DNA from a shawl, supposedly found near Catherine Eddowes' body, linking it to descendants of both Eddowes and Kosminski. However, the shawl's provenance is highly dubious, and the DNA analysis has been thoroughly debunked by the scientific community. A third strong suspect, and the personal favorite of Inspector Aberline, was Seweryn Klosowski, who used the name George Chapman, another Polish immigrant. Chapman lived in Whitechapel during the murders and even worked as a barber on the very street where Annie Chapman was last seen. He had some rudimentary medical training from his time as a junior surgeon's assistant in Poland. Most damningly, he was a confirmed serial killer. He was convicted and executed in 1903 for the slow, agonizing poisoning of 3 of his successive common-law wives. When Chapman was arrested, Aberline reportedly told the arresting officer, "You've got Jack the Ripper at last." Chapman seems a strong fit. He was a known killer operating in the right area, with a history of extreme misogyny. However, his method of killing, poison, is vastly different from the Ripper's. While a serial killer's methods can evolve, the shift from brutal up-close mutilation with a knife to the slow, detached act of poisoning represents a significant psychological leap. It's possible, but it makes him an imperfect fit for the precise, frenzied ritualism described in Bond's profile. These are just a few of the dozens of names. There are doctors like Robert Donston Stevenson, an occultist who checked himself into London Hospital and became a suspect of his own making. There are fringe theories pointing to everyone from Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, to a member of the royal family. The painter Walter Sickert has been accused, most notably by the novelist Patricia Cornwell, who has spent millions on research trying to prove his guilt through disputed DNA analysis of stamps and iconographic interpretations of his paintings. Each theory has its champions and its detractors. Each suspect fits the profile in some ways and contradicts it in others. And that is the central point. The profile created by Thomas Bond was not a magic key that could unlock the killer's identity. It was a guide, an educated guess, a way to narrow the infinite possibilities of a city of millions down to a manageable, understandable type. It was a tool to help investigators think their way inside the mind of an enemy who was, by his very nature, incomprehensible. The hunt for Jack the Ripper was, by all conventional measures, an abject failure. The killer was never brought to justice. The files were never closed. The mystery remains, a permanent and tantalizing question mark in the annals of crime. But to judge the investigation solely on its outcome is to miss its profound historical significance. The Ripper murders occurred at a pivotal moment. It was the dawn of the modern age. Cities were exploding. The media was becoming a powerful force. And science was beginning to offer new ways of understanding the world and the people in it. The Whitechapel murders were the first great media-saturated manhunt. The name Jack the Ripper, a media creation, made the killer an international sensation, a figure of folklore. The constant press coverage created a feedback loop of public terror and police desperation that shaped the entire course of the investigation. But more importantly, the case represented a collision between an old world of crime and a new kind of criminal. The existing police methods were designed to solve crimes of passion, greed, or revenge. A detective would ask, who benefits, who had a grudge, who knew the victim? But the Ripper had no discernible motive in the traditional sense. His victims were strangers. He gained nothing tangible from their deaths. His motive was not external, it was internal. It was a dark, psychological compulsion that demanded release. To hunt a man like that, the police needed a new vocabulary, a new framework. They couldn't just investigate the crime. They had to investigate the man's soul. This is the enduring legacy of the Autumn of Terror. It was the moment that law enforcement realized that to catch a certain type of monster, you have to learn to think like one. Thomas Bond's report, though rudimentary by today's standards, was the first official step in that direction. He took the physical evidence, the pattern of wounds, the locations of the bodies, the escalating violence, and used it to construct a behavioral and psychological sketch. He theorized about the killer's lifestyle, his personality, his emotional state. Every time a modern-day profiler at the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit pores over a case file and talks about an unsub's signature, cooling-off period, or victimology, they are speaking a language that has its roots in the gaslit terror of Whitechapel. The pioneers of the BAU, men like John Douglas and Robert Ressler, frequently cited the Ripper case as a foundational. The anatomy of this case, therefore, is not the anatomy of a killer, for we will never truly know his identity. It is the anatomy of an idea. The idea that the things a killer does at a crime scene are not random. They are a form of communication. They are a biography written in blood. The Ripper's brutal mutilations, the organs he took, the taunting letters he may or may not have sent, all of it pointed toward a particular kind of disordered mind. The failure to catch him forced the pioneers of criminology to accept that the most important clue left at a crime scene might not be a footprint or a weapon, but the ghost of the killer's personality, imprinted on the horror he leaves behind. Jack the Ripper was a butcher, a misogynist, and a terror, but in his wake he inadvertently became an architect. His shadow forced the world to develop a new science of detection, one focused on the why, not just the who. The ghost of Whitechapel was never captured, but the effort to give that ghost a face changed criminal investigation forever. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.